Imagine a German town complete with authentic Bavarian architecture, nestled right here in the heart of America. But here's the twist. It was built not by immigrants, but by German prisoners of war during World War II. How did this secret settlement come to be, and what untold stories lie within its unique history? We journey now into an extraordinary, little-known chapter of the Second World War I of human paradox and subtle irony, of war's cast-offs erecting homes in a foreign land, of civilians watching, soldiers working in service of a war still raging overseas. The name of this place, Eichenstadt, Pennsylvania. The year, 1944. The setting, deep in the rural reaches of the United States, where the war at once feels distant and yet creeps in through the echo of shovels, the clang of hammers, the sob of the wind through skeletal scaffolding. In early 1944, the shock of war had penetrated every corner of American life. Factories hummed at full tilt. Ration cards passed through crisp hands. Young men boarded troop trains bound for Europe and the Pacific. Meanwhile, in remote pockets of the United States, particularly in states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Idaho, the government established camps to house the thousands upon thousands of captured Axis soldiers. These were German men, now prisoners of an Allied war machine, far from home, separated from family and homeland, yet bound by the unyielding chains of military captivity. It was in such a camp that Eichenstadt's story began. At the heart of Pennsylvania's rugged highlands lay Camp Greenwood, an internment and labor camp complex built in 1942 by 44. The camp held over 3,000 German officers and enlisted men. Many hailed from the 6th Army or Luftwaffe units captured in Sicily or Normandy. Among them was Hauptmann Erich Weber, former pilot of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, and Feldwebel Klaus Hoffmann, who once marched into the USSR during Barbarossa in 41. They did not know their next destination would not be a battlefield, but a construction site, an American town built for them, by them, and yet hidden in plain sight. The decision had its roots in the Allied manpower shortage at home. With so many American men in uniform overseas, the U.S. War Manpower Commission looked for ways to harness the labor of POWs for civilian projects, provided these complied with the Geneva Convention's safeguards. By early 1944, the camp's command had negotiated a project to construct a cluster of homes for American workers in the rural valley adjacent to the camp. The twist came when it was decided the homes would be given a Bavarian architectural motif, both to provide meaningful work for the prisoners and to build a morale-boosting model village for returning GEs. And so, on April 15, 1944, the clearing in the woods was marked out. The foundations were laid, and the German prisoners moved in no longer just prisoners, but builders. The morning air at the work site carried the scent of fresh timber and wet shale, the hiss of circular saws, the dull thump of sledgehammers, and the murmur of German voices mixing with American overseers' calls. Feldwebel Hoffmann recalled, years later, "We hammered, we chopped, we laid brick that we were building something in a land we once considered the enemy was a strange kind of duty." The overseers were nominally American civilian contractors from nearby Johnstown, Pennsylvania, but the workers themselves were older German soldiers, those deemed low risk, granted the right to receive small wages, and permitted limited movement within the compound. The woods around Camp Greenwood echoed with a curious rhythm. German drills, American orders, the shuffle of boots on rough ground. The village plan comprised 30 houses, each a 2-story timber frame structure, half timber-board and white stucco with dark beams, shutters painted forest green, pitched roofs of cedar shakes, small front porches supported by carved posts. The design took direct inspiration from the prisoner builder's home in Bavaria, down to the motif of carved eagles and stylized edelweiss on fascia boards. Many German prisoners volunteered to draft the decorative wood carvings. Hauptmann Weber, though technically an officer, wielded a chisel with surprising skill. He crafted a relief of a soaring eagle over one gable, the wings outstretched, as though breaking free from a Baltic dawn. Each house cost roughly $3,000 in 1944, dollars paid for by the U.S. government under the War Production Board's Civilian Housing Initiative. The site also included a small central green, a flagpole, a modest community hall, wood-paneled, with vaulted ceiling beams, and 2 workshops, a carpentry shop and a metal work annex. The carpentry shop was staffed by prisoners who plunged into tasks, cutting roof trusses, carving balusters, fitting windows. The metal work annex saw German machinists refurbishing surplus American farm equipment and fabricating decorative iron brackets in the Bavarian style. One of the more striking images from the construction phase. As spring turned to summer of 1944, a German POW labor team stood in front of a row of half-finished homes, wearing American-issued gray overalls with the letters PG for Prisoner of War, German, stenciled in black. A U.S. Army sergeant walked among them, Sergeant James Jim Harper of the 598th Engineer Battalion, his boots sinking into mud from overnight rain, clipboard in hand, cane-light glasses slightly askew. He inspected the joinery, made notes, and paused to ask Hoffman how the carving of timber posts was progressing. Hoffman gestured with his mallet and nodded. "Ja, Herr Harper, the balusters are ready." The local villagers of Greenwood Valley, others took a pragmatic view. The men were working, wages earned would be taxed, and housing would be constructed for returning veterans. On warm evenings, villagers glimpsed German voices carrying through the woods, saw accents, survival, softened, but unmistakably Rhine-toned, smelled the wood shavings of the carpentry shop, drifting on breeze. For many, it was the first time enemy soldiers appeared as craftsmen rather than as combatants. Life in Camp Greenwood was circumscribed, but within the constraints the prisoners carved out a degree of normalcy. Each day the labor gang marched at 0700 from the POW barracks to the builder's site, boots crunching gravel, rifles slung in trucks, overseers at the columns. The German prisoners received a small monthly stipend, 10 cents per day holders of their own petty economy. They bought cold drink treats at the canteen, swapped letters home, played cards. Evening workshops encouraged artistic activity, carvings, cabinet making, and even small-scale theater performances in German. There were moments of laughter, of shared cigarette breaks, of nostalgia in broken letters home. When the prisoners weren't building, they returned to camp where the evening sky glowed, and uniform-like old barracks stood like silent sentinels in the darkness. Many read German poetry by dim lamps or debated the political ruin of their homeland. Hoffman, writing later in his memoir, described the odd sensation of carving a Bavarian-style roof truss while knowing his own home in Munich lay in rubble. And Weber, in a letter smuggled home via the Red Cross, noted how ironic it was to build a village for our former opponents in a land we once imagined to destroy. Meanwhile, for the Americans in Greenwood Valley, the village under construction became a symbol of hope. Posters in the local USO club boasted homes for our heroes building now. The idea was that when the war ended, American servicemen returning to civilian life would find in Eichenstadt a modern home, rooted in craftsmanship, ready for occupancy. That vision lent the building site almost a pilgrimage-like atmosphere. Each house a promise of peace, each nail-driven board a step toward normalcy. Yet there were tensions. Some local residents felt uneasy about the presence of German soldiers so close at hand. Rumors circulated of escape attempts, of fraternization, of sabotage plots, none of which proved true. Camp security remained tight. Every evening the prisoners marched back across the field, arms registered and counted. Guards watched the light. The war was never far away. One of the more remarkable aspects of Eichenstadt was how secretive its origins remained, even long after the war. The local government had classified the project under civilian housing, and many of the records were filed under generic wartime housing programs. The identity of the builders, German prisoners, was omitted from public-facing documents. To the outside world, the project appeared as a conventional American housing development erected in a remote valley. Only the sharper of local historians later discovered that the men who hammered the beams and carved the timber posts were former members of the Wehrmacht. Why keep it secret? Several reasons. First, there was concern about public perception. Americans might balk at the idea of German posts building homes on U.S. soil during wartime. Second, the work required a degree of trust and cooperation that the military did not wish to advertise widely. Third, and perhaps most poignantly, this dramatic reversal, enemies becoming builders, carried a subtle moral ambiguity the authorities preferred to obscure. One afternoon in July 1945, as the war approached its final chapters, a local newspaper photographer captured a scene. 2 German prisoners carrying a cedar truss down the lane of unfinished homes, while a uniformed American engineer directed them with a wooden yardstick. The image was filed under Housing Project Greenwood Valley and ran as a small black and white photo in the back pages of the Johnstown Times. No caption mentioned POWs. Years later, in 1952, the same photo turned up in the local Historical Society archives under the heading Early Greenwood Valley Housing. The connection to the German laborers was forgotten. August 1945 brought the end of the war in the Pacific. Victory in Europe had come a few months earlier. The German prisoners at Camp Greenwood, many of them far from home for years, now awaited repatriation. Some had heard of their towns destroyed. Others of family lost. Many carried guilt, shame, or quiet relief. Among them, Hoffmann and Weber were released by the winter of 1946 and repatriated to a Germany under Allied occupation. They kept in touch with a few American overseers and drafted letters reflecting on the curious bond the labor had forged. Back in the United States, the newly built village of Eichenstadt opened to American families in late 1946. Young veterans from Pennsylvania's Appalachian, battalion men who had landed in Normandy, fought in the Ardennes, endured the blood-soaked earth of Hurtgen Forest, now moved into houses they had watched go up over the preceding 2 years. They pressed keys into half-timbered doorways, leaned on carved porches, and raised their children beneath rooftops built by former enemies. The irony was not lost. The veterans attending the opening ceremony on the 2nd of December 1946 found that the guest of honor, Sergeant James Harper, stood beside Hauptmann Erich Weber, now demobilized and working in civilian architecture in Bavaria via a short-wave radio link from Germany. The 2 men exchanged formal greetings. Harper spoke of service and rebuilding. Weber spoke of reconciliation and craftsmanship. The audience sat in the community hall, the same building where German prisoners had once gathered, now draped in American flags and wreaths of pine. Let us pause and meet some of the individuals whose lives intersected in this strange milieu. Hauptmann Erich Weber was 28 when captured in Normandy in July 1944. A pilot by training, he found himself on the fuselage of a C-47 as it dropped supplies to Allied troops, an unwitting twist of fate. When transferred to Camp Greenwood, he was offered the chance to join the construction gang at Eichenstadt. He accepted, partly out of a desire to do something meaningful, partly as a reprieve from the monotony of captivity. Weber became a master of ornamental carpentry and later wrote, "I learned that wood speaks its own language, that in shaping it we shape ourselves." He returned to Germany, earned a degree in architecture, and made a career designing housing projects that emphasized human dignity, perhaps shaped by the paradox of building a town for the former enemy. Feldwebel Klaus Hoffmann had served on the Eastern Front and had seen the picture of war in its harshest elements: winter, mud, blood. By early 1944, he carried the weight of years of combat. At Greenwood, he found an outlet in the physical labor of building homes, something life-giving instead of life-taking. He later reflected, "In one moment I had been trained to kill. In the next I was shaping shutters for children in America." After repatriation, he settled in Munich, worked as a cabinet maker, and occasionally returned to Pennsylvania as part of a post-war veterans exchange program. On the American side, we have Sergeant James "Jim" Harper. At 24, he had served in the 598th Engineer Battalion, landing in Normandy in June 1944, repairing bridges under fire. When reassigned stateside to the Greenwood Project, he initially regarded the German prisoners with suspicion. Yet over time he came to recognize their skill, their quiet pride, the strange dignity they brought to the craft. At the opening of Eichenstadt, he said, "We built more than houses here. We built a bridge, across war, across nations. Finally, the civilian families who moved into Eichenstadt deserve their place. One family, the Millers. Robert Miller, a former infantryman who had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, returned home in 1945 and accepted an allotment in Eichenstadt. He and his wife Clara moved into house number 14 in January 1947. He fixed the shed in the backyard, taught his son to ride a bicycle on the gravel lane between houses, and occasionally paused to look up at the carved balusters and ask himself, who struck these lines of wood? Who lived in that camp? Clara Miller later told the township historian, "The house felt strong. I never felt like it was built by prisoners. It felt like it was built by people who knew exactly what a home should be." Eichenstadt did not dominate the historical record. It stood quietly in the hills of Pennsylvania, a relic of wartime exigency rather than a national monument. But in the decades that followed, the site became a point of reflection on war, labor, reconciliation, and memory. In the 1970s, a doctoral dissertation at the University of Pittsburgh brought the story into the open, uncovering photographs, letters, and interviews that revealed the German fabrication behind the homes. Local historians visited the houses, measured the carved motifs, and compared them with photos of pre-war Bavarian villages in Germany. They found astonishing similarity. Some critics said the story was too tidy. The enemy built our homes, conjured illusions of reconciliation that ignored the broader suffering of war, ignored the thousands who died, the homes destroyed, the lives uprooted. Others embraced it as an example of humanity amid hostility, of ordinary men doing extraordinary work in extraordinary times. By the early 2000s, Eichenstadt was designated a historical district by the township of Greenwood Valley, and a small museum opened in the community hall, displaying original carpentry tools from the German builders, wartime letters, and photographs of Camp Greenwood. Visitors stand on the porch of house number 10 and read a plaque, "Built 1944 by German prisoners of war. This house stands as a symbol of labor, service, and reconciliation." Children on field trips ask what German prisoners were doing here. Local elders tell stories of the odd construction site, with unfamiliar accents and steady craftsmanship. Let us return to spring 1944 and follow a single day at the construction site. At dawn the sky was gray, mist still rising from the valley floor. The prisoners assembled outside their barracks at 6:50. They wore standard issue overalls with PG stenciled on the back. They had breakfast of oatmeal, bread, and occasionally a sliver of bacon. At 7:15 the trucks arrived. The men climbed in, boots muddy, hands still smelling of camp soap and pine boards. The drive to the building site passed through woods, across fields, past woodland springs that glinted in the half-light. They arrived at 7:40. The foreman gave a brief safety talk in English, translated by a German crew leader, and the hammers began. The task that day, erecting the roof trusses on house number 17. The men hoisted beams, hammered metal plates into place, lifted cedar shakes, nailed them in rows, adjusted the fascia boards. At mid-morning they paused for a coffee break. The smell of strong American coffee mixed with the scent of freshly cut wood. Hoffman walked the line, wiping sweat from his brow, and commented to Weber, "By summer we will be finishing the wood shingles. The houses will look like they came from home." Weber nodded, glancing at the valley, then up at the gables rising against the sky. Lunch in a nearby mess trailer, sandwiches, fruit, milk. Some of the prisoners sat together. Others leaned quietly in corners. A few giggled at a joke told in German. Others gazed at blueprints spread on tables. After lunch, the afternoon was spent fitting windows and shutters on the workshop building. A young German carpenter learned to install American-made casement windows, a small shift in technique, but he adapted quickly. Sometimes, as daylight waned, the men paused, looked at the houses now standing, and allowed a moment of quiet. As dusk approached, the work stopped. Tools were gathered. "Roll call," called the guards. Trucks returned the men to Camp Greenwood. The night brought darkness, the camp lights glowing like distant stars in the valley. The German men walked back from the trucks across the field, their boots echoing in the quiet, their voices subdued. Sleep came, and the promise of tomorrow's labor. Behind the story of Eichenstadt lies the broader story of war's cost, the lives lost, the towns destroyed, the millions displaced. The German prisoners were not uniform archetypes, they were individuals with homes, hopes, regrets. When they carved balusters and lifted roof trusses, they were, in a sense, shaping the future of men whose armies they once opposed. And in that shaping lay a subtle transformation, the tools of war repurposed, the hands that might have held rifles now wielding hammers, the prisoners whose duty was to resist now constructing. For the American families who moved into Eichenstadt, the houses were more than wood and nails. They were a foundation, a fresh start in a world scarred by conflict. The village underlines how war sometimes births unexpected alliances, unexpected art. The carved eagles and edelweiss on the homes may seem playful, decorative touches, yet they symbolize something far deeper, the interweaving of cultures, the sense that in rebuilding we also reconcile. Today the narrow lanes of Eichenstadt still curve gently between trees, the cedar shake roofs glinting with decades of rain and sun, the timber beams darkened by age. Visitors walk the sidewalks, read plaques, imagine German voices whittling wood in the dusk. The story of those houses offers a lesson that the boundary between enemy and ally, prisoner and worker, is not always rigid, that humanity persists even amid conflict. We remember the German prisoner builders, like Weber and Hoffman, and the American overseers like Harper, who oversaw a settlement unlike any other. We remember the countless nails driven, the roof trusses lifted, the nights by the mess trailers, the voices softened in broken English, the return to home across an ocean, the resettlement of veterans in those homes. Every home in Eichenstadt stands as a testament to those hours of labor, those efforts of reconciliation, those small acts of building in the shadow of war. So when you imagine a German town in America, half timber-bird, and nestled in the Pennsylvania hills. Know this: its builders were once on the other side of the battlefield. Know that the war's echoes carried more than bombs. They carried wood shavings, hammer blows, the distant laughter of men far from home. And know that in this little-known place named Eichenstadt lies a story of transformation, from conflict to construction, from prisoner to craftsman, from enemy to builder. May we carry its memory not just as a curiosity of history, but as a reminder that even in the darkest times, human hands can build, human hearts can reconcile, and from the ruins of war can rise the foundations of peace.